Imagine the scenario: you're a medieval lawyer, preparing your client for trial. Your client is accused of the most abominable of crimes, murder. Allegations have been made that they've eaten up an infant. To make things more difficult, your client is a pig. During the Middle Ages, animals that committed crimes were tried in the courtroom. Perhaps that's not as crazy as it sounds. One of the uncommon aspects of the medieval period was that animals could be prosecuted like humans. This is the European history of trying animal criminals and either executing them or for insect plagues, ordering them to leave town by a specific day and time. This is incomprehensible, but as early as 824, all the way up to the middle of the 18th century, animals were held to the same moral standards as humans, suffering the same punishments and even rotting in the same jails. Yes, there was such a thing as legal animal trials. Although the veracity of medieval animal trials is questionable, there is no doubt that some of them actually occurred. Animals of all kinds could be brought before a secular court, which had the power to sentence them to death for their crimes, either individually or in groups. Church courts also were granted authority to put animals on trial. Bishops and other church officials were their judges. A wide range of crimes could be committed by these animals, including murder, complicity in bestiality and destruction of crops and property. If found guilty, larger animals were executed or banished, while smaller ones were excommunicated by ecclesiastical courts. Before going into details into the Middle Ages, it must be mentioned that in the ancient world, apart from animals, inanimate objects could be brought to court as well. Everyone and anything would face a judge if suspected of a capital crime. Even corpses and inanimate objects faced execution. Evans, a scholar, cites the trial and punishment of a statue in Athens as an example. The trial and execution of animals did not only take place in the Middle Ages, as this practice is recorded in other civilizations as well. However, this is just one theory that's been proposed to explain this strange phenomenon. Over the years, scholars have come up with their own hypotheses to explain the existence of these unthinkable animal trials. One explanation, for example, is that certain animals are endowed with moral agency and can therefore, like humans, be held accountable for crimes they committed. Therefore, when an animal was brought to justice, it was treated like a human being and followed the strictest legal procedures, making the whole event sober. In some cases, the animals also wore human clothing when they were brought to court. For example, the execution of a pig convicted of infanticide in 1386. The pig was wearing a waistcoat, gloves, and a pair of underpants before the execution. The worst serial criminals in Europe appear to be pigs. The frequency with which pigs were tried and sentenced to death was largely due to the fact that they were allowed to roam the streets in large numbers. The earliest known documentation of a medieval animal trial was in 1266. The trial took place in Fontenay-Auxiliary-Roses, not far from the French capital Paris, and involved a pig accused of committing infanticide. Evans recorded incidents in which pigs chewed off noses and ears and even killed innocent kids, one swine going so far as to eat a whole child. Pigs violated the law. They were tried in the court church and found guilty of a serious violent crimes. They were sentenced to death by beheading. Another more mild-mannered pig was hanged in France in 1394 for having sacrilegiously eaten a consecrated wafer. However, almost the entire animal kingdom was subject to human rule of law. Evans in his book lists some 200 instances of animal executions, and these are just the ones whose records have survived Europe's tumultuous history. There were executions of bulls, horses, dogs, sheep, and perhaps most curiously, dolphins, which he gives no information on other than they were tried and executed in Marseilles in 1596. There was a great range of punishments for such critters, which weren't always sentenced to death. Rats, for example, were often given well-intentioned advice to leave any house where their presence was considered undesirable. Evans wrote, "In one case," he added, "a sow and a donkey were sentenced to be hanged. After an appeal and a retrial, they were sentenced to be simply knocked on the head." But capital punishment often went way beyond the brutality of hanging. Even the innocent animals faced the wrath of judgment. Ancient people looked upon the strange animals and creatures as victims, especially would be horrifically executed along with their offending human. In one instance, a mule condemned to be burned alive along with a man guilty of buggery was inclined to kick, so the executioner cut off its legs before setting it on fire. On the other hand, Europeans could sympathize with animals on which they were very dependent for food and work. The trials of pests like locusts and weevils reached a comical absurdity probably unique in European history. In the 16th century, Bartholomew was the most famous public defender of insects. In a crafty bit of lawyering, he argued that bringing all of his furry clients to justice was impossible and they should be forgiven. From that moment, animal lawsuits were brought before the church courts. And the courts would have excommunicated these criminal animals, a so-called anathema, a kind of excommunication for beings not belonging to the church. It was the anathema that church courts used to bring upon to invoke against malicious clients, and they firmly believed in the consequences of this powerful curse. See how the priest once cursed an orchard because its fruit lured children away from Mass, and how it remained barren until the Duchess of Burgundy ordered the curse lifted. But here's the brutal irony of animal trials: in pulling even the lowliest bug into our justice system, we personify them, however, then in brutalizing them for supposed misconducts, we lower ourselves to the brutality we would expect from wild beasts. By this logic, animals aren't truly automatons, they lack free will. Animals are programmed to eat, sleep, mate, and repeat, as such a lot of philosophers all through history have argued. They are not capable making their personal decisions, but engaging in complex behaviors, like in the case of the friars' pigs egging each other on to commit murder. Long before modern movements came on board to classify animals as beings just as capable of feeling pain and emotion as human beings, medieval Europeans understood perfectly well that beasts could suffer the pains of torturous death. The assumption that animals were in any way capable of understanding the laws and morals of humanity was wildly absurd.